A friendship lost. Tina Selensky sat on the couch, flipping through the pages of a photo album. She kept going back to one picture. It was a picture of one of her closest childhood friends, Nicole, when she had been alive and well. The picture was of the two of them when they must have been 8 or 9 years old, smiling and posing for the camera, standing with their arms wrapped around each other in front of Nicole's trampoline. Nicole's mother had taken this picture. Years had passed and the two girls grew apart, both due to Tina's move to a new town and Nicole's prior mental collapse, which landed her in a mental institution where she eventually took her own life. Tina had gone to her funeral, and that's when Nicole's grieving mother had given the picture to her, explaining that she felt it truly captured the feeling of their childhood bond, and thus belonged to Tina. It did capture that bond. It radiated that nostalgia. Even now, whenever Tina looked at the picture, it always took her back to that time. Their faces were so bright with joy. How did something so precious turn into what it did? Nicole was special. She had abilities, though they would only show themselves on occasion. Nicole had been able to see future events, things which were yet to happen, anywhere from a few minutes to a few years in the future. But they were always things that were important, more specifically, things that involved the safety or well-being of someone she was close to. Tina had once had a crush on a boy in their 3rd grade class named Alex. One day Nicole came to her, warning her that the next week at school, Caitlin, a popular girl who had a crush on Alex as well, and disliked Tina for her charming kindness, had come up with a plan to scare and embarrass her at lunch in front of him. Tina listened to Nicole, and it paid off. Next week, Caitlin intentionally left her art project in her classroom desk instead of bringing it in her art folder, and got permission from the art teacher to run back and grab it. She came into the classroom to sneak a wild mouse she had captured into Tina's lunchbox. She didn't know that Tina and Nicole had next claimed that they had forgotten their projects as well and followed her to the classroom. They crept up behind her as she was carefully attempting to transfer the mouse to Tina's lunchbox, and both screamed simultaneously, causing Caitlin herself to let out a terrified shriek, dropping the mouse and running out of the room in embarrassment. There came a day when Tina went to Nicole's house to ask if she could play, and Nicole's mother, Sherry, had told her that Nicole was acting strange. She wouldn't speak or come out of her room and had been moaning and groaning all day. Sherry had let her inside nonetheless, and when Tina went upstairs to Nicole's room and knocked, she heard the groans. "Nicole?" she had called through the door. "Are you okay?" "Tina," came Nicole's strained voice from the other end of the room. "Don't." She sounded as if she were struggling. Her stressed voice turned into a low growl that Tina could no longer recognize. The door unlocked and began to open. Nicole's new voice spoke the words that still haunted Tina to this day. "Play with us, Tina." Tina fled the house in horror. Days passed, and Nicole was no longer around, refusing to leave the house no matter what. Tina no longer saw her at school. Eventually, Tina was told that her friend had been locked up in a hospital and would have to stay there until doctors could figure out what was wrong with her. They tried, but Nicole was only getting worse. She had turned violent, and visitation by family and friends was not allowed. There were nights Tina would cry over the loss of her friend. She made up most of Nicole's happy childhood and was her only friend. Something had taken her, and it pained Tina to think about. She blinked as a tear escaped and fell. Just then, Linda, Tina's other good friend who had once met Nicole when they were children, walked in the front door, home from work at her usual time, 6 o'clock. They lived together now, and the bond between the two of them was just as strong as the bond Tina had shared with Nicole. "Hey," Linda said in a soft voice, seeing Tina's watery eyes as she looked up. "What's the matter?" She set down her purse and walked over to Tina, sitting down next to her. She looked at the picture and said nothing, but wrapped her arm around Tina. "Whenever I think about her," Tina said, wiping her eyes, "I always start thinking about how unfair it was, what happened to her." "I know. Did I ever tell you that in the only letter she ever sent me from the hospital, she told me again to stay away?" "No, you never mentioned that." "That's all it said, in sloppy, scribbled handwriting, like she struggled to write it. Stay away. I tried visiting her more than once before then, but the staff never let her have any visitors because of her violent outbursts, and because she was always telling them to keep her friends and family away from the hospital." Suddenly, Tina felt a pull. Something pulled at her consciousness. She wanted to see why she was supposed to stay away. "I wish I knew why she said that," she murmured, then looked up at Linda, about to choke the words out, but something stopping her. Then she forced them out. "I want to visit that hospital," she finally said. "Are you sure?" Linda replied, worried. "I mean, wouldn't that be too hard on you?" "I just feel like, I don't know, maybe I just want to see where she spent the last part of her life. I guess for closure." "Okay, well," Linda broke off for a moment. "I know how much she meant to you. She broke off again. "Do you want to just go ahead and visit that place tonight? You've mentioned it before, and I guess we could just—" "Yes," Tina interrupted. "I don't know why, but yes." "All right," Linda replied, standing up. "Let me just take a quick shower and change, and we'll go there together. I think I know where it is. It's not far from here." Linda grabbed her purse and ran upstairs, and soon Tina heard the shower turn on. As she sat there on the couch, the feeling grew stronger. It grew stronger and stronger, that nagging feeling after so many years of knowing nothing, that before she knew it, she had closed the photo album and tossed it aside, grabbed her own purse and ran to the door. She put on her boots and left. What was she doing? She didn't even quite understand, but she started up her car nonetheless. "It'll be getting dark soon," she thought. She pulled out of the driveway and took off down the road. Tina knew where this hospital was. She sped through neighborhoods and around turns, barely stopping at stop signs and nearly running a few red lights. Something inside was pulling at her. "Come, Tina. Come and see," it said. Tina finally saw the large sign, Shanmeyer Hills Psychiatric Facility. The place looked just a little worn down, perhaps in need of renovation. Tina pulled into the parking lot and got out. It was now 7 o'clock, and the spring sunset had arrived. There weren't many cars in the parking lot. Cue the tumbleweed, Tina thought as she began making her way across the parking lot, looking up at the vines that climbed the walls of the building. But there couldn't even be tumbleweeds. Apart from the distant cars and the echoing sound of Tina's boots on the cracked pavement, there was no wind and nothing to be heard. The air was so still and dead that it felt absent, almost as if it were afraid to come around here. The automatic doors at the entrance slid open, and Tina walked inside. The warmer air engulfed her, and she was comforted. The subtle hum of appliances helped make the atmosphere seem a lot less dead. So small, yet such a difference. The waiting room was completely empty, except for the nurse station, where a woman who looked to be in her mid-40s with short, curly brown hair sat at the front desk reading a book. Tina approached her. "Excuse me," she said softly as the woman looked up. What exactly was Tina going to say? Hello? I'm here to ask about my deceased friend. Hello, I'm here because, well, I had a friend who used to be committed here, and Tina broke off. How was she actually going to get information on Nicole? Even if she was no longer a patient, her information was still confidential. Well, she passed away a couple years ago. I still don't really know what to ask for here. I guess I'm just looking for closure. The woman looked interested. Name? She said. Hers? Mm-hmm, the woman replied, pursing her lips and wheeling her chair over to the computer keyboard. Nicole Ramsey? The woman retracted her hands and looked up at Tina with a dead serious expression on her face, before wheeling her chair backwards over to the open door to what must be a lounge-type area in the back. The woman didn't take her eyes off Tina as she called back into the room. Maggie? Yeah? Came another woman's voice from inside. Will you come out here? A brief moment passed before another woman who looked to be in her mid-40s with straight, dark blonde hair emerged from the back room. She, too, looked at Tina with a face that thought it knew something, but wasn't exactly sure. She wants to know about Nicole, the woman in the chair said in a hushed voice. It was then that Maggie's face fully changed to, Yes, I do know something about you. Tina stood there, getting nervous. Her cell phone began to ring in her purse, but she reached in and silenced it without looking. There was a pause before Maggie spoke. I worked in the ward Nicole was in, she stammered. I saw her quite a bit. What is it you wanted to know? Well, Tina began, we were close friends when we were little, and I know she wasn't well for pretty much most of her life, until it ended here, and I guess I was just wondering... She suddenly choked up. Wondering what kind of person she ended... I mean, was it ever determined what was happening to her? Come with me, Maggie said, walking out the side of the front desk and guiding Tina down the hall beyond it. As they walked, Tina began to feel more uneasy. They finally reached a storage room with lockers lining the walls. There were a few chairs inside, and Maggie arranged two to face each other, then reached behind Tina and closed the door, gesturing for her to sit. Tina walked over and sat down, and Maggie sat as well. For a moment, she just sat there with a thoughtful expression, gazing off to the side, before speaking up. I recognize you, she finally said. What? Tina muttered. From a drawing, Maggie stated. I don't know if you know, but since you were a close friend, you probably do. She paused before continuing. Nicole was able to see things? I know, Tina replied. Things that hadn't happened yet, I know. She paused, then, what was the picture? Maggie's expression took a slightly grave turn with raised eyebrows, and she looked at the floor. We don't have it here. Here at the hospital? No, here in storage. It's still in her room. Tina was confused. Why? Well, that wing was closed off after what happened. After Nicole killed herself? Maggie looked up, looking concerned. That's just it, she replied, shaking her head. I don't think she did. What? Tina was shocked and angry. What are you talking about? That's what everyone was told by the hospital, even her mother. I don't think she did it. Neither do some other people who have worked here. There was no way she could have gotten that straight razor into her room. It was ruled a suicide, but there's a tape. Maggie suddenly stood up and stepped over to one of the lockers, unlocking and opening it with nervous hands, as if she had been waiting for this moment. She reached inside and pulled out a small plastic bag holding a miniature cassette tape recorder. She sat down with it. We gave her crayons and paper after we found out she liked to draw. It was really her only hobby. But after a lot of strange things started happening, things like her drawing pictures of other people in the room with her, Pictures that showed tall figures standing behind nurses visiting her room with captions like, "You don't see," and "They're in here." She paused. But one morning there was crayons scribbling all over her ceiling. That's when we started hanging this tape recorder on the outer doorknob of her room at night. Another pause. "It picked up some things." "Things?" Tina murmured after a moment. "There were voices talking to her." Tina's eyes began to water, and the air in the room seemed to pull at every hair on her scalp. The woman took the tape recorder out of the bag. "It only works in her room for some reason. It worked normally while we were using it to record her, but ever since it won't play unless you're standing in her room." Maggie's face of concern turned to something like dread. "If you want, you can listen to it, but you'll have to go into her room in the closed-off ward. That place is dark now, always dark. Even in the daytime, not much light comes in those windows. At night, it's like an underground cave or something. Nobody goes there anymore. It doesn't feel right in there. After Nicole died, things started happening to other patients. They started getting cuts and bruises that weren't self-inflicted, even though they were the only ones in their rooms. The same type of injuries Nicole started getting on her body." Tina stood up. I guess I'll go, but..." She paused. "What was the drawing?" It was you." The woman then said nothing else. What was this forsaken drawing that they were apparently so afraid of? Tina took the tape recorder. Now the voice that spoke to her mind was louder and clearer. "Come, Tina. Hurry." Maggie stood up and guided Tina out of the storage room, farther down the hall, then right, all the way up to 2 double doors with windows that revealed there were no lights on in the hall beyond. "Most electronics don't seem to work past this point. Not ever since the day your friend died, except for..." She looked down at the tape recorder in Tina's hands. "That, and flashlights as long as they're not too big." "Oh," she said, reaching into her shirt pocket, pulling out a tiny flashlight. But Tina had already reached into her purse and pulled out a slightly larger, but still small, flashlight. The woman smiled and put hers back in her pocket. She then entered a 5-digit code on the door's left keypad. It beeped twice, and a small click came from inside the door. "Room 113, Maggie stated, nervously stepping aside. She didn't even want to touch the doors. She just stood there waiting for Tina to make her move. Tina switched on her flashlight and pressed open one of the doors. As soon as she stepped slightly into the darkness of the secluded ward, instantly she felt sick with anxiety. It seemed to engulf her, like the hallway was swallowing her up. The air in here was heavier and so much colder. Something about this ward was messing with her nerves. This area felt threatening. She stepped farther into the ward, sliding her hand along the door, part of her not wanting to let go of it, not wanting to let go of the light. She felt like a small child who didn't know how to swim, being lowered into an 8-foot deep swimming pool by the hands of an adult, without anything to keep her afloat. She glanced back at Maggie one more time, who really looked afraid now. She looked almost as if she wanted to turn and run, and Tina suspected that maybe, after going in all the way, she just might. "Good luck," she said in a hushed voice. Tina finally stepped all the way into the heavy darkness, her flashlight dimming just a bit, but remaining on. She let go of the door, and it swung shut. The darkness swallowed her. The hands lowering her into the pool let go, and she was on her own. One of the things that frightened Tina the most was that this ward was completely silent. Aside from the soft clicking of her boots as she walked slowly and cautiously, there was absolutely nothing. No outside wind, no draft whistling in through the cracks, No creaks or settling of the building, no metal pipes groaning. Nothing. Tina began shining her light on each of the metal doors and their numbers. 102, 103. The deeper she walked, the tighter the dread took hold of her. It became somewhat difficult to breathe as the air got heavier. "You're almost there, little girl. Hurry." Tina walked on, quickening her pace a little. 105, 106, 107. She became aware that along with the growing feeling of dread and the intensifying weight of the air, something was changing. It took her a moment to realize that it was something about the flashlight beam. "Is the flashlight getting dimmer?" she thought. She had just replaced the batteries about a week ago and hadn't used it since. 109, 110. The flashlight was getting dimmer. The closer she got to Nicole's room, the thicker and heavier the darkness got. It swallowed up more light and any feeling of being grounded. She began to feel almost as if she were walking across some kind of invisible path miles into the sky, in a different dimension. The feeling of drowning intensified. She felt as if she might even fall backwards into nothingness and be gone. She had to stay grounded. Her flashlight grew even dimmer. "You're almost there. Just a little more." 112. 113. She was there. "Well done, little girl." Tina stood before the closed door of the room that her friend spent her final days in, the room she may have well died in. She reached out her hand, struggling to keep it still. She grabbed hold of the doorknob and glanced back in the direction from which she came, shining her flashlight back down the hall. Nothing. There was nothing but darkness. She could not even begin to see the hall back where Maggie had taken her to the storage room. She could see the beginning of the light from her flashlight, but the darkness swallowed up the rest. She turned back to the door, her light flickering briefly as she moved it through the dark. Slowly, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. It made no sound. Inside the room, the walls were covered in senseless scribbles of different colors, all in lines that went around and around the room. On the ceiling were more of these lines, drawn a bit more aggressively. The only objects in the room were against the far wall, a small desk and a chair pulled up to it. Tina stepped into the room, almost feeling suffocated now. Moving through the dark, she approached the desk and saw what looked like landscape-oriented drawings on it. There were blood stains on them, droplets of dark red as though it had been sprayed. The drawing on top depicted a girl with short, blonde hair standing with her throat cut wide open, red going everywhere, soaking her clothes. It was Tina. Those clothes were the same exact ones she wore now. This was surreal, but it was Nicole. She then remembered the tape recorder. She had set it in her purse, so she reached in and pulled it out, shining the flashlight on it. She could see that the miniature tape inside was at about the halfway point. She pressed the play button. Nothing happened. The wheels inside weren't turning, and there was no sound when she held it up to her ear. Then she checked the battery compartment. There were no batteries. That woman hadn't even checked to make sure there were batteries. How would she listen to it? It took 2 AA batteries. She paused. So did her flashlight. Did she even dare? She stood there for a moment, contemplating this decision. She had to know what was on this tape. She didn't come all the way here just to be sent back. Tina set the tape recorder down on the desk and grabbed onto the back of the flashlight, preparing to unscrew it. She stood there and counted to 3. 1, She was starting to feel like she wasn't alone. 2. Dread tightened its hold in her chest. 3. She quickly unscrewed the battery compartment, and as the spring inside pushed the cap off, the beam of light vanished, and Tina was plunged into complete darkness. Less than darkness. Nothingness. She frantically dumped out the 2 AA batteries in her hand and set the flashlight down on the desk in front of her, feeling for the tape recorder. She pressed her thumb against the leftmost end of the battery compartment, feeling for a spring. She then inserted the batteries accordingly, but didn't put the cover back on. These 2 batteries were her lifeline. She didn't want to separate herself from them. She turned the tape recorder around and felt for the play button. She hesitated. She was afraid of what she might hear. She hadn't even heard Nicole's voice in years. At last, she pressed the play button, adjusting the volume knob as the sound of idle tape noise came from the little speaker. There were a few moments of silence before she heard a young woman's voice. It was Nicole. She sounded strange and disturbed, and seemed to be talking to herself.
These people stand behind me and watch me draw. They like to watch me draw pictures at my desk. But sometimes they want me to come play instead. And if I don't, they get angry. So I should always go play to keep them happy. What? But we already played today. You said I could draw tonight. I just want to draw tonight, please. No, I'm sorry. I'll play.
We stand behind you and watch you draw. We like to watch you draw pictures at your desk. But sometimes we want you to come play instead. And if you don't, we get angry. That's why you should always come play to keep us happy.
Tina dropped the tape recorder on the floor, hearing it break into pieces and send the batteries rolling. She dropped to her knees in a panic, frantically feeling around for them, gasping. She found one battery, then under the desk against the wall, she found the other. She backed out from under the desk and stood up, fumbling her hands over its surface, trying to grab the flashlight with her quaking fingers. She found it and began slipping the batteries back inside, both silently pleading for the light beam to show up again, but dreading it just the same. When it came back on, what if something else was in the room? Something that hadn't been there before. She noticed a stronger feeling of company standing somewhere in the room with her. She fumbled with the small circular cover of the flashlight's battery compartment, trying to align the threading to screw it back on, but was struggling. At last, the cover screwed back on and the dim flashlight beam reappeared. Tina anxiously began shining it around the room, looking left, right, up at the ceiling, under the desk, everywhere. No matter how much she turned and turned, shining the light everywhere, there was a nagging feeling of someone or something behind her, constantly. She finally stopped and looked back down at the blood-stained drawings. She felt strangely that she needed to see these. Regaining control of her panicked breathing, she pinched the edge of the paper on top and slid it aside. The next drawing seemed to depict this very hospital. The closer Tina looked, the more familiar the scene became to her. Then she froze. For a moment, her breathing stopped completely. She saw all the same vehicles that had been in the parking lot when she arrived, including her very own, pulled into its space on the right. She slowly slid aside the page to reveal the next drawing. Now, Tina was depicted holding a small tape recorder to her ear. Next, she was shown dropping it to the floor with a look of horror on her face. Tina couldn't stop herself as her hand reached and revealed the next drawing. Her blood ran cold. She was depicted shining a flashlight down at a desk, flipping through papers. Tina stared at the edge of the page. There was only one more left. Part of her wanted to turn and run all the way back to the light of the waiting room, but another part of her refused to move, longing to slide away this final page and reveal the last foretelling. She stood paralyzed for a minute, these conflicting urges battling inside her. Finally, she grabbed and threw aside the page, staring down at the very last one. It showed her still standing at the desk, but now 2 very tall figures, colored in pitch black, stood side by side, right behind her. They had ear-to-ear grins with sharp teeth and massive bulging eyes with tiny pupils staring down at Tina, who seemed unaware of them. The same voices growled in unison behind her.
"Play with us, Tina!"
She let out a shriek, whipping around just as her flashlight flickered out and she could no longer see anything. But something was there, and it reached through the darkness, wrapping its hands around Tina's throat. It squeezed. Claws. They poked in between cold fingers and dug into Tina's neck. A sort of communication began to happen. It hated Tina. It hated her. The floor gave way, and Tina felt herself falling, fast into an endless abyss. It swallowed her up. She was trapped and completely helpless. She couldn't breathe. She felt the presence of death all around her. Not just ordinary death, but an endless death. In all directions, there was no end to the darkness, the despair, the anguish. It had no mercy, and it was paying attention to Tina. Time was no more. No time had ever passed, and no time was to come. There was nothing she could comprehend, nothing more to ever exist but anguish, forever. She began to see things before her. She saw herself walking down the long, dark hallway. 2 very tall figures followed close behind, bearing their teeth down at her. 2 girls lay dead in their coffins beneath the earth. It was Tina and Linda. Her dear friend had come to find her and had joined her in death. Tina saw her own lifeless body fall to the hospital room floor, her neck crushed and lacerated. Suddenly, there was a flicker of light somewhere. Even though it was small, it gave strength. Tina used it to rip herself from the grasp around her throat, coughing and gasping for air. She was still alive and could once again feel the floor beneath her. She stumbled toward the right side of the room, holding out her own hands in front of her until she bumped into the wall. She then ran diagonally across the room, feeling for the door as the long fingers never once left her back. They scraped and scratched at her. Tina felt and heard her jacket being torn. Her desperate, outstretched hands finally met the side of the doorway, but just as they did, something horribly sharp slashed her down the back, then slashed at her again and again, cutting her up. It wasn't claws. It was something else. It felt like a razor. Tina screamed in pain and horror, scrambling out the doorway and turning left. She ran. She ran down the blinding darkness of the hall, seeing nothing in front of her as her flashlight refused to turn back on. She was greeted by that same dreadful feeling of being out in water she couldn't swim in, drowning in nothingness. She felt as though she were running in place. The voices growled together just behind Tina. She longed desperately for the light from the ward's entrance. She ran and ran, still gasping, keeping her eyes straight ahead. She was waiting, searching for that very light, but she wasn't seeing it. She wasn't seeing anything. It had to be there. It had to. At last, she saw a faint glow in the distance ahead. It took the shape of two squares. They were the windows on the double doors. They seemed to move closer at no more than a snail's pace. It was like trying to run up a downward moving escalator. Tina ran until at last the doors seemed to be getting closer. Just then, she felt two hands grab hold of her jacket, then her arms, then her. She struggled, but another hand slid its long, cold fingers into the hair on her head and pulled on it with force, painfully jerking her neck backward as she dropped the flashlight and fell to the floor. She frantically reached her own hands up to the one that clutched her hair, trying to pry the fingers loose, to no avail. The hands began to drag her backwards down the hall. She opened her mouth to scream, but she couldn't. It was like some kind of nightmare. Nothing would come out. The hands clutched her hair and arms, quickly pulling her back into the darkness. It was then that Tina heard a loud, familiar voice that seemed to come from all directions.
Let go of her.
It was Nicole. Suddenly, the hands let go all at once. Tina didn't waste a single moment as she leapt to her feet and began running, hyperventilating through tears. She ran faster than she knew she could, nearing the door, not looking back. The light of the doors got closer and closer until finally they arrived, and she burst through them at full speed into the light of the hall, collapsing to the ground on her hands and knees, gasping and sobbing. Just then, she heard a familiar voice and looked up to see Linda round the corner from the waiting room. "Tina!" she cried, running down the hall, followed by Maggie. Both of them looked panicked. Linda dropped to the floor where her friend knelt and hugged her tightly. Maggie stood behind, watching with deep concern, her hands over her mouth. "Tina, what the hell happened to you? I've been calling and calling, but it's been going straight to your voicemail." Linda gasped frantically. "I didn't know you had left until after I got out of the shower and got dressed and saw you weren't there. You weren't picking up, so I got here as fast as I could. I took a wrong turn, but I finally found this place. What happened to you?" Linda's voice began to break as she frantically looked over all the cuts and scratches on Tina. Tears began welling up in her eyes, and she hugged her friend tightly. "Nicole didn't kill herself," Tina murmured through tears over Linda's shoulder. "She was killed." Linda looked Tina in the face. "How? I don't understand." "Something had been with her for a long time. And ever since that day she told me to leave her house, I knew. It's what brought her here, and after years of tormenting her, it finally just killed her." Tina began gasping as her throat tightened. "I don't know what they were, Linda. I can't explain it. There were two, and—" It's okay, Linda said, once again embracing her friend in tears. "I believe you." The two friends remained in a tight embrace while Tina sobbed and Maggie remained silent. "Let's go home," Linda finally said softly. The two of them left that awful place, and as they did, Tina felt something. She felt as though someone else were leaving as well, someone familiar and kind. She felt a comforting assurance, a warm sense that things had been made right, that everything was all right. She would never forget what happened that night, nor would she ever forget who had saved her very life.